Right, so my own talk today is about, I've been called a master of isms. So there's a lot of isms today, and for 25 minutes I've got 43 slides, I'm afraid. So there's going to be a lot of information, and you won't soak it all in, but hopefully, you know, it will brew in your minds, and you can return to it. It's being recorded, so you can pause it later if you want to watch it again. Not that you would. Okay, so my own talk is going to introduce some kind of Western notions, panpsychism, animism, and pantheism, old terms, but I thought that it might be useful to see where those words come from and what they mean when we consider bridges to other cosmologies, metaphysics, worldviews. So this is the plan. I'm going to give you a name. I'm going to give you some preliminary definitions so you know what I'm talking about a little bit. Then I'm going to talk about the brain faith, a little bit controversial. Then panpsychism, animism, pantheism. I was originally going to talk about paganism as well, but that would be too many slides. But I'll interweave it a bit. And then some concluding thoughts. So this is the aim. Expanding Western theories of consciousness and cosmos could allow for greater reciprocal engagement between Western and indigenous worldviews associated with psychedelic experience and practice. So maybe this serves as a kind of bridge. And remember, I'm a philosopher, not an anthropologist. So I'm not merely describing views, I'm interested in analyzing them and examining them. So preliminary definitions. Pan. There's a god Pan, that's from the wind and the willows. But Pan means all, Greek. So pantheism means all is theos, all is God, all is deity. Essentially, it means that there is a mind of nature, one cosmic consciousness, as it were. Panpsychism, which is somewhat different, means minds in nature. So that kind of means that there are minds in not only humans, animals, bees, trees, etc., but also molecules, atoms, etc. The whole world is sentient. The whole universe is sentient. But there are many types, as I shall go into, hopefully, very quickly. And then animism, the original meaning was souls in nature. And I say souls rather than minds because, as we'll see, animism was coined in the modern version as a dualism, so a soul as opposed to a body. Whereas pantheism, panpsychism is a bit more monist, that mind and body are the same thing. Anyway, the brain faith. So, I know, one thing I should have said before that, actually. All of these pans, and some people call me Peter Pan, actually, as a result of this, all of them see nature as alive with sentience, rather than seeing nature as mostly lifeless. Kat Harrison mentioned this in her talk this morning. So the whole world is alive, it's enchanted, it has intrinsic value. Why do we generally in the West not see the universe that way? I used to say materialism, but I think you can hone it down a bit more to this. What I essentially call now, I could call it another ism, neuroessentialism, but people will forget that. So I thought the brain faith. It's the belief that the brain is necessary and sufficient for consciousness. So there's a general belief that, you know, if there's sentience or consciousness experience, what does that mean? That's another talk. You need a brain. It's a general Western view for the last few hundred years. But, interestingly, this view is not empirically verifiable. You can't prove this in any way empirically. It's not true by definition, like 2 plus, all bachelors are unmarried is true by definition. So it's not really scientific. It's not empirical, and it's not logical. It's not illogical either, but it doesn't follow by definition. So it's not scientific, but it is a metaphysical belief that underlies much Western scientific research. So it's just interesting for a start to see that how metaphysics really underlies what we call science, if you can generalize. it implies, of course, that the overwhelming vastness of nature, of the cosmos, is lifeless, dead, without any intrinsic value. It hasn't got value for itself, it has value for those who can conceive or receive value. So in other words, animals with brains. But, you know, the brain faith, or neuroessentialism, neuroreductivism, is but one proposed solution to the intransient mind-matter problem, sort of like, almost akin to the hard problem of consciousness. How does mind and matter relate? So the brain faith, believing that the brain is needed and is enough, necessary and sufficient, is only one solution. There are many other proposed solutions. But a lot of people, just a lot of people seem to think there are just two solutions to this. There's either the brain is responsible for consciousness, or there's dualism. So the mind and the soul and the brain are completely separate. But there are many, many alternatives. So when we question the brain faith, we expand options for consciousness and cosmos. So, for example, we allow for the idea of machine consciousness. Doesn't have a brain, of course. For 4E cognition, like the theories of extended mind and so on. And also panpsychism, pantheism, and animism. So there might be credence in these views. And psychedelic experience can feel, it seems, panpsychological. You feel that nature is alive. It can certainly feel animistic. I'll define that properly later. And pantheistic, as we shall see, around the world, globally. So the interesting question, really, for me is, are such experiences merely delusions of the brain, or may they hold some reality? And I should say, I personally have been brought up in England and partly in Sweden, very secular countries, really, despite the Church of England. And this kind of brain faith, I realized, was a default view. It's an ideology we're all born into. It's not explicitly told to people, but it's implicit in much of what we are taught. And of course, we're not in the English-speaking world. We're generally not taught philosophy in schools either. It's a bit better on the continent. Anyway, so let's quickly look at some of these in a bit more detail. So panpsychism. All is mind. I'll give you a trip report first. So this is from Richard Ward, 1957, from a drug taker's notes. Very interesting book of his experiences with LSD. Anyway, he wrote this. I realized on 100 micrograms LSD that the whole universe is made up of things which have their own natures, relationships, significances. I hear an echo when I speak. It's very odd. I hope that was right. Significances. Yeah? Okay, and that in each I'll start again. I realized that the whole universe is made up of things which have their own natures, relationships, significances, and that in some universal scale, each thing has its proper degree of awareness. Interesting, it comes from 1957, I should say. So let's look at panpsychism a little bit more. So panpsychism is a doctrine that sentiences, so not necessarily consciousness, it could be like subconscious, sentiences exist fundamentally throughout all of actuality, from humans to bees, trees, fungi, dogs, cells, molecules, etc. It's coined by the Neoplatonist Patrizzi in 1591. It was quite a common view amongst Renaissance thinkers. Some of them got burnt for it. Bruno was burnt in the year 1600, partly for his views, these views. Other endorsing thinkers include Spinoza, Leibniz, Schopenhauer, William James, Alfred North Whitehead, who Matt will talk about more, I believe, today, Galen Strawson, the contemporary philosopher, and so on. I should say panpsychism is making a comeback in academic philosophy in the last 10, 15 years as well, partly because of that mind-matter problem. It's generally monist, though many varieties exist. I say this because it immediately differs from animism in this sense a little bit. So it's monist in the sense that mind and matter are both expressions of the same thing. They are not, they're conceptually different, but they're not actually ontologically different. And panpsychism, importantly, differentiates monads from aggregates. So a monad is like a subjective unit. So a monad would be something like an organism or a molecule, whereas an aggregate would be a collection of those, so like tables or clothing. Even Bruno said that, a piece of clothing hasn't got, as a shirt, for example, it's unitary consciousness. So that's an important thing. Panpsychists don't just believe tables and chairs are conscious, not as such anyway. But interestingly, they would consider, for example, maybe a river or a mountain as an aggregate, whereas animists don't necessarily do that. And that's one interesting difference. If you really delve deep into panpsychism, how to draw that line between a monad and aggregate becomes very complicated. If one just thinks about a beehive or something like that, or the heart or something. Anyway, we won't go into that. And I can't go into all the arguments. There are many rational arguments for panpsychism. I'll just give you a flavor through a few quotations. So Schopenhauer wrote this: "We must learn to understand nature from ourselves, not ourselves from nature." In other words, we often think we objectify nature, we find laws of nature, we predict the future and so on, and then we apply that knowledge back to ourselves. And then we get the hard problem of consciousness. How does consciousness fit into that big problem? So Schopenhauer is saying that if we start with ourselves, we know we are minded, and then we project that outwards, we get a different view of the universe. William James, who's, as many of you know, is the sort of founder of psychedelic science in many ways, he wrote, "If evolution is to work smoothly, consciousness in some shape must have been present at the very origin of things." In other words, it's much more parsimonious to believe that consciousness was then simple form and evolved into a complex form, for example in humans, over time, rather than that, first of all, there was no sentience, proto-sentience, subconscious at all, and then at one point in the universe, in the history of the universe, boom, there was consciousness. Isn't it much more parsimonious to think it was there all along as a part of what we call matter? These are just the tips of the iceberg, of course. Alfred North Whitehead, who taught at Cambridge and then Harvard, his philosophy is considered the most developed system of panpsychism or pan-experientialism. And he's got an interesting associated theory of prehension, which is a kind of relational epistemology or ontology. Now, I realize I've lost a lot of you by saying that, but basically what it means is that my consciousness becomes part of the object. And do you remember Matt at the beginning, he said, the eye that I see the sun with is part of the sun. He said it much more poetically, but that was the gist of it. And this kind of fits in with that. It also fits in with some interesting animist theories from De Castro and others. There are also ecological considerations, ethical considerations with panpsychism and animism. There's Freya Matthews, a contemporary panpsychist. She writes, "The philosophy of nature has become urgently relevant in our time because the environmental crisis is pointing to a misalliance between humanity and its world. Panpsychism has thus, for me, been a project of metaphysical rehabilitation conceived within the discourse of environmental philosophy." And I should say that deep ecology is founded by the Norwegian philosopher Arne Næss, and he bases most of that on Spinoza, who is a pantheist, panpsychist, as we shall see. Now, animism, very quickly, because it's not my field, but I'll just give you the origins of the term. It's coined in its modern usage by the founder of anthropology, first professor of anthropology at Oxford, Edward Burnett Tylor, in 1871. This is it. He writes, "I propose here, under the name of animism, to investigate the deep-lying doctrine of spiritual beings, which embodies the very essence of spiritualistic, dualistic, as opposed to materialistic philosophy." So animism, in its modern sense, was termed as a dualism. That might not be correct, and it would be very interesting to delve into indigenous worldviews and question this. In fact, on Saturday morning, we've got a session on this where we will try to get to the heart of the matter. Not that we will. So animism is defined as a universal dualism, not just a dualism for humans, like Descartes defined it, but everything is ensouled, and materialism assumed as a correct default metaphysics. At the time, British emergentism, which is brain faith, was prevalent. Aldous Huxley's grandfather, Thomas Huxley, for example, preferred it. And also, interestingly, animism was framed within the notion of a cultural evolution, also prevalent at the time. So his notion was that religion starts with animism, and you still find those. I mean, the book was called Primitive Culture, and it was found within indigenous communities and is also found in the European past. But it was just considered sort of by default wrong. But today the term animism has been adopted by certain indigenous peoples. There's a new animism, and there's much work on the relation epistemology that's said to be essential to animism with De Castro and so on, that the subject becomes object for knowledge. Here's an example. Here's a quotation from David Kopenhauer, who's from his book, The Falling Sky, Words of a Yanomami Shaman. The forest is alive. This is where its beauty comes from. The white people may not hear it complain, yet it feels pain, just like humans do. Its tall trees moan as they fall, and it cries in pain when it is burned down. So that is quite, we would say, a panpsychological viewpoint, which seems to coincide with that worldview. 5 minutes, okay. Pantheism, right, okay. Alan Watts, on LSD. The individual discovers himself to be one continuous process with God, with the universe. To those who have known it, it is as real and overwhelming as falling in love. Bertrand Russell, a known atheist, he wrote Why I'm Not a Christian. He wrote this: one of the most convincing aspects of the mystic illumination is the apparent revelation of the oneness of all things, giving rise to pantheism in religion and to monism and in philosophy. So, pantheism. All is God. God is all. God is nature. Nature meaning universe. This cosmic mind is identical to, rather than outside of the cosmos. So, as opposed to theism, where God is outside and the creator of the universe, pantheism claims that the universe itself is God. There are many types of pantheism, and some people say, well, some people say pantheism is basically atheism, because if you're saying that nature is God, you're saying really there's no God, right? But no, because that nature is not pure matter. Not for Spinoza, who didn't coin it. Someone coined it, pointing to Spinoza, Raphson. And I can't talk about Spinoza's philosophy. If you haven't heard of him, he was a Jewish philosopher based in Amsterdam. He was excommunicated by his fellow Jews, and books were banned by the church, and you couldn't show any sympathy for him for 100 years after his death, until the pantheism controversy in the 1780s. Anyway, this is a classic pantheism. It's extremely logical, detailed. There are very good reasons for believing it. It's not... Maybe he's completely wrong. Maybe. Oh, no, he's not. Yeah. Anyway, so Spinozism became the hidden religion of Germany in the early 1800s, and today, a lot of people, I think, confess that they're quite sympathetic to it. That God is nature, and that thought or mind and extension are the same things. They're both expressions of that nature, of that God, of that substance. Cosmic consciousness is a representation of pantheism coined by Edward von Hartmann in 1869 in his book, The Philosophy of the Unconscious, one of the first main books on the unconscious. It's a very, very depressing book, I came to realize when I was doing the research for this. The aim of existence is non-existence, because existence is pain, suffering, and the evolving world process, guided by the unconscious to itself, is the unconscious should lead us to this notion that life is void, and interestingly, cosmic consciousness means that you come to that realization, so it's a rather depressing illumination. He writes, the question becomes the expansion of the egoistic into a cosmic consciousness, an endeavour, of self-seeking personal feeling into self-denying impersonal feeling, to further the movement of the whole which alone is of consequence. In other words, ego loss. So like a sort of psychedelic platitude that you find in this old German work. Interestingly, I can't read all of that, but animism was coined in 1871. Cosmic consciousness was coined in 1869. Both were conceptualized under this framework of cultural evolution, that culture evolves logically, as it were. Darwin's theory of evolution came out in the same year, 1869. And interestingly, you can see the shadow of Hegel behind a lot of this, I think. Hegel had this idea of logical historical progress, and this kind of influenced the zeitgeist of the time. It conditioned Marxism as well. 1 minute. William James wrote that he only understood Hegel after taking nitrous oxide, another interesting psychedelic connection. And so we see cosmic consciousness and animism were both under this kind of notion of progress, which was partly Hegelian. There are other factors as well, of course. Nietzsche said, without Hegel, there could have been no Darwin. And without Spinoza, there could have been no Hegel. Tyler complains about the obscure pantheism, which is so rife among German metaphysicians, coming from a fetishism, a generalized, more systematic. But, of course, that's all based on the supposition that we know what reality is, that reality is fundamental material, everything else must be some kind of delusion. But this is not known. No, well, at least not many people agree. No one agrees with this. Well, people agree, stop. Right. There you go. The last thing I shall say from Albert Hoffman, synthesized LSD, what more can a person gain in life than that God nature reveals himself to him? Quoting Goethe on Spinoza. So, there you have it. Thank you.